Good morning, Shalom, and thank you for coming this morning to hear us the last day. And thank you, Irene, for that lecture. You supplied some facts which absolved me from having to tell them, so you have been great. Also, it's a social workers panel, which I don't know if you did it by accident or intentionally, it's great. So before I start my lecture, I want to show you a clip from a film probably you have never seen ever in your life. It's a really an obscure movie, and then I'll explain why we will be watching this clip.
Monsieur Rick,
Yes?
could I speak to you for just a moment, please?
How'd you get in here? You're underage.
I came with Captain Reno.
I should have known.
My husband is with me, too.
He is? Well, Captain Reno's getting broad-minded. Sit down. You have a drink? No, of course not. Do you mind if I do?
No. Monsieur Rick, what kind of a man is Captain Reno?
Oh, he's just like any other man, only more so.
No, I mean, is he trustworthy? Is his word?
Oh, just a minute. Who told you to ask me that?
He did. Captain Reno did.
So I thought so. Where's your husband?
At the roulette table, trying to win enough for our exit visas. Oh, of course, he's losing.
How long have you been married?
8 weeks. We come from Bulgaria. Oh, things are very bad there, monsieur. The devil has the people by the throat. So, Jan and I, we did not want our children to grow up in such a country.
And so you decided to go to America?
Yes, but we have not much money, and traveling is so expensive and difficult. It was much more than we thought to get here. And then Captain Renault sees us, and he is so kind. He wants to help us.
Yes, I'll bet.
He tells me he can give us an exit visa, but we have no money.
Does he know that?
Oh, yes.
And he's still willing to give you a visa?
Yes, monsieur.
And you want to know?
Will he keep his word?
He always has.
Oh. Monsieur, you are a man. If someone loved you very much, so that your happiness was the only thing that she wanted in the world, she did a bad thing to make certain of it, could you forgive her?
Nobody ever loved me that much.
And he never knew. And the girl kept this bad thing locked in her heart. That would be all right, wouldn't it?
Do you want my advice?
Oh, yes, please.
Go back to Bulgaria.
Oh, but if you knew what it means to us to leave Europe, to get to America. Oh, but if Jan should find out. He is such a boy. In many ways, I am so much older than he is.
Yes, well, everybody in Casablanca has problems. Yours may work out. You'll excuse me.
Thank you.
But what I'm going to talk to you about is another family from Bulgaria that made their way from Europe to Palestine, not to America. I haven't been able to find out whether that story is actually based on real evidence. I have a suspicion it doesn't, because Casablanca was not en route to Palestine, and the film was made in 1942. But I'm still trying to find out why that story has been included in the film. What I will tell you about is another Bulgarian family, my own family, that have made their way from Bulgaria to Palestine. And I'm going to focus on those pertinent years, 1941, 1948. And there are two questions which are occupying me about this story. One is about who is a refugee? What does it mean to become a refugee? What does that category mean? And the other one is about making decisions. A lot of people at that time had to make decisions. Some of them had to marry. That was a decision. My research is about trying to deal with these two questions. I prefer to think of the people who left Europe at that time as refugees rather than immigrants. I think, and there's some evidence that the term refugee was already in use at that time. You see here the report from 1939. So people knew that what was going on, and people knew that people would have to leave. Things were getting bad. And I pose a question. I would say that any non-Nazi European at that time in Europe was actually a refugee or potentially a refugee. Nobody who was not a Nazi could have really stayed and feel safe in Europe at that time. People had to make decisions about how safe it would be to stay on in Europe, to stay in the place where they grew up, where they had family ties, cultural ties. The people who made the decision to leave mostly survive. The people who made the decision not to leave and hope that things will get better, or they'll find their own way of coping with the Nazi regime. Most of them did not survive. So when talking about refugees, I'd like to make two references to begin off, to start off with. One is Hannah Arendt in a letter that she wrote to Karl Jaspers, a teacher and colleague who'd left earlier to America. She tried to grapple with the fact of her being a refugee in America. And I think it's interesting what she says, that being a refugee is no longer something that's imposed upon you because of something you've done. The mere fact of who you are makes you a refugee at certain historical and political conditions. She wrote quite a lot about that. She was very unhappy about being a refugee, but she stayed on. She stayed on in America long after it was necessary in terms of her survival. A later thinker, also Bulgarian, French-Bulgarian psychoanalyst, Gyula Kristeva, and I think she expanded the term of refugee in the tradition perhaps of Barthes and Foucault, etc. So for her, I think being a refugee or being in exile does not involve any physical act. You can be a refugee and stay at home. You can be in exile, but the mere fact that things have changed around you make you feel a stranger in a place which you consider to be a homeland, a stranger to yourself, because once your home has changed, you can no longer feel safe at home, you can no longer feel safe within yourself. So, Bulgaria, it's known and it's true that most of Bulgarian Jews were saved from the Nazis. The reasons why are still in dispute. Probably it's a mix of all known reasons. King Boris was in favor of trying to keeping the Jews safe. Also, the Archbishop of Bulgaria was in favor of trying to keep the Jews of Bulgaria safe. And the parliament opposed several attempts to pass more severe anti-laws that were passed. So still, there were 48,000 Jews in Bulgaria when the war began. They all survived, apart from 13,000 other Jews who were not Bulgarian Jews to begin with, but were Jews that lived in areas which Bulgaria was given by the Nazis, Macedonia, Thrace and Piro, and Bulgaria moved into those areas as part of the pact between the Bulgarian government and the Nazi authorities. And those Jews were rounded up, as you'll find, I'll tell you more about that later, and were sent to Auschwitz and Treblinka. None of them survived. And today Bulgaria does recognize the fact that well, this is a point in dispute because Bulgaria holds a day of memorial, 10th of March, every year to celebrate the fact that the Bulgarian Jews were saved from the Nazi regime. But there's protests against that because the Jews of Thracia, Macedonia, and Piro were not saved. So the Jewish communities which still exist in those areas and the local communities protest against the fact that Bulgaria is presented as if it has saved its Jews. So it's true and it's not true. Bulgaria saved some of the Jewish communities that lived in areas over which it had control. So these are the historical, very broadly, very roughly, into which I'm going to now delve into detail. And my whole work today is based upon the memoir of Dr. Leon Alfandari, my grandfather, if you hadn't guessed by now. He wrote a memoir in 1979 when I was 17. The memoir is written in Hebrew, and he presented that to me and my sister, who was 2 years younger. And I read it then and since. And when I saw the call for papers for this conference, I thought this is just right, as if the conference was tailored to house such a memoir. And the memoir covers all of his life, but I'm going to concentrate on 4 events which I think are pertinent to the topic of this conference. But first, a few words about Leon Alfandari. I'm actually named after him. My second name is Leon. So he was an officer in Bulgarian army. He was actually born in Romania, but the family moved to Bulgaria very soon after he was born. He was served as an officer in the First World War. He was awarded with medals for that. He became a medical doctor after graduating from Hamburg, he studied in Vienna and he actually tried to get into Vienna. And I had this fantasy that had he succeeded, maybe he'd met my other grandfather, Sigmund Freud, and that would have been an interesting coincidence. But that had happened. He wasn't accepted into Vienna. He writes in his memoirs that he thinks that he wasn't accepted to Vienna because he was Jewish. I'm not sure how much that is true, whether that was the reason for his rejection, or maybe that was part of his already sense of alienation in the place which he considered to be home. And after he graduated, he moved with my grandmother, whom he married in 1927. She was 19 at the time. And I'd like to pick, here to insert a footnote, a very important footnote. This is also her memoir. Even though she hasn't written the memoir, I wish she had. I think that her story would have been fuller and richer and would have described things which he hasn't described, being a woman, being the one who's actually kept the house going. I think was in debt to her, and he acknowledged that for keeping and allowing him to practice his medical profession in Bulgaria and in Palestine. So they settled in Lom, which is a small town on the Danube, on the border with Romania in 1928, and established a practice. There was a very small Jewish community in that town, and he was like one of the leading characters of that community. He did very well as a doctor. They bought a big house. They went on holidays. They had servants. He was a very well-respected figure in the community. My father, who wrote also a memoir, years later describes his experience of working with my grandfather in the streets of Lom, and people would stop and bow to him, take their hats off. So they had a good life, la dolce vita. I think they had a very, very good life, and they enjoyed being in Bulgaria. Even though he was a Zionist, I don't think he was really entertaining a real option of moving to Palestine. I'm not sure what he was thinking. I don't think he did. I think he was just enjoying the life that he had. But in 1939, he started writing a little notebook where he taught himself English. And that is a curious fact. He's no longer alive. I can't ask him why, and I didn't at the time. But for some reason, he thought that maybe he would need English. And he kept a very meticulous handwriting. This is quite a thick, small notebook which he kept, which he put in medical terms and translated them into English, thinking maybe that one day he would need to use that language away from Bulgaria. So I would suggest that in 1939 he was beginning to think that things might change. And he writes in his memoir that in 1940, with the rise of the Nazi Party to power, the skies became overcast over our heads. He sensed that something was going. This is a picture of him there on the right, with my father in the middle, my grandmother, and my grandfather's brother, Joseph, outside the clinic in Bulgaria. This is a photograph of some parade. It's dated 1936. I'm not sure what it represents. I still haven't been able to find anyone who can tell me what are these people standing there for. But I put it just an illustration for something. So I'm going to go quickly through the four events which I think are pertinent to his passage from Lom to Palestine. The first one was his encounter with the Pencho, which was a small boat carrying illegal immigrants from Bratislava through the Danube. And it was a really, really rickety boat. It collapsed, I think, almost immediately once it set on journey. And just before it did, it stopped in Lom, or just outside Lom. And my grandfather came to the rescue of the people on the boat and managed to give them some supplies and some medical aid. And the ship went on, sailed on. It didn't get very far. It was stopped by the Italians once it reached the Mediterranean. And all the people on the boat were taken to internment, where they stayed till 1943. And then they traveled, from there they traveled to Alexandria and by train to Palestine later on. This is, I think, one of the events that began to shape and change my grandfather's view about how safe it might be to remain in Bulgaria. He was then, once in Palestine, years later, he was awarded by the people on that boat who all survived and reached Palestine and formed an organization where they yearly commemorate the passage and the survival, and he gave my grandfather a medal for having been of aid. But the police didn't like that very much. They didn't like his involvement, and he was called for a prolonged police investigation. And he was really spared, in his view, just because of his medical and military background as a senior doctor. But things have changed for them. He writes, the memoir is written beautifully. It's very rich, even though Hebrew was not his mother tongue. He wrote very nice Hebrew, and it's very moving just to read the account. I obviously can hear his voice as I read it, but I think even for somebody who didn't know him, you can see that he put a lot of effort in trying to create a nice impression of his experience. And I think he describes his mood then in 1939, 1940. At that time, they were still having the good life. You can see here two photographs, one from Versailles and the other one from Interlaken, where they spent holidays as late as July 1939. They still were able to enjoy the illusion that things weren't that bad, and they were able to go out on holidays. But then, and this is, things will begin to quickly change. As I said earlier, the provinces of Thrace, Macedonia, and Pyrrho were given over to Bulgaria. Laws were passed against Jews in Bulgaria, even though the parliament, as I said, was trying to be protective towards them. He was prohibited from practicing medicine. He was spared because, again, he was spared in the sense that he was allowed to practice medicine illegally. He was still seeing patients in his clinic, but he wasn't supposed to get any money for it. He had some funds that he was managing to draw from to survive. This is the way. By the way, this is the way he made his rounds. This is my grandfather on a coach, being driven by a driver, taking him for house visits around Lom and the surrounding villages. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes. Hurry up. The second impertinent and very tragic, horrendous event that he was involved with was what happened in Drama. Drama was part of those areas occupied by Bulgarians. The Greeks there obviously offered resistance to the Bulgarians which occupied the area, and he, as an ex-officer, was called in to help form a medical team to combat malaria. He was an expert in malaria, so he was called there to offer medical and civil assistance. But as he was there, he was a witness to many horrendous atrocities committed by the Bulgarian soldiers against the local Greek population. In a very odd turn of events, which I cannot really back up by facts, there's a possibility that my maternal uncle, who was a partisan around that area, was one of the people that were involved in the Greek uprising against the Bulgarians. So it's possible, as a writer of fiction, I would like to think it's possible that my paternal grandfather had met my maternal great uncle and aided him. Because what my grandfather did at that time was trying to aid the Jewish communities of that region, but he was horrified by what he'd seen at that time. And when he went back to Lom, he realized that things are getting worse and not going to change for the better. They were already forced to wear the Yellow Star of David. He was given the round yellow button because he was an officer of the First World War. He was given a privilege to have a higher class, be a higher class Jew, and he walked around with that round yellow button, which I still possess. And then, in March 1943, the Nazis began to round up the Jews of Thracia, Macedonia, and Pyrrho, put them on trains, and they traveled on the Danube. They traveled to Lom by train. Lom was on the river, and in Lom they were taking from the carriages and placed on ships from which they sailed all the way to Vienna, from which they were driven by train to Auschwitz and Treblinka. So my grandfather was there. And he writes in his memoir that he heard his name being called out because some of the Jews on the train were Jews he'd met a year earlier when he was in Drama himself. And he describes, this is quite a lengthy piece in the memoir. He describes in greater detail that I brought here. He describes the way they were trying to help the Jews on the train to survive the very short stay on the carriages. They brought them some food, medical aids, and nappies for the children, for the babies, overcoats. They rounded up all the local Jews in Bulgaria, my grandfather did, and tried to aid the Jews on the train. Obviously, they were totally unsuccessful in preventing what happened later. But that obviously left a great impression on my grandfather and my grandmother. But they stayed on. As the Bulgarian Jews were not threatened more than being round, they were taken to labor camps. The Jews were not allowed to remain in their homes. They were taken to labor camps, one of which was very near Lom, so my grandfather was in touch with the Jews from Sofia and other places, in Plovdiv and other towns in Bulgaria, where all the men above a certain age were rounded up and taken to these labor camps. But still, they were able to lead some kind of normal life, if you could say, restricted but normal. But then he was rounded up, the house was rounded up in 1943. The local authorities suspected that he was aiding the British army in the bombing that took place in that area. And again, he was saved from being imprisoned by his war record and the bribes he paid. But I think that has resolved him, that he can no longer stay. I think he felt threatened. This I remember him telling me as a child. He felt physically threatened. He thought that he was going to be next on the trains. The Jews of Bulgaria didn't know that, they couldn't have known that they were to be spared as they were. And that's the point where he had to make a decision. And it was a kind of singular decision because very few Bulgarian Jews made that decision at the time. Most Bulgarian Jews remained. But he, for personal reasons, felt that he was a great threat and he decided to leave. It happened one night. The way he told the story was very dramatic. They just packed a couple of bags one night and bribed their way all the way to the Turkish border. And there they discovered they had the wrong kind of exit visas, so that they had to travel back to Sofia and bribe again and get counterfeit exit visas, and managed to get all the way to Istanbul, where they boarded a ship and arrived to Haifa. 18th of April 1944, they arrived. And I could go on about the journey, but I won't because I probably have 5 minutes left.
That is exactly right.
5 minutes. So this is like the first passage, the first format. So those are the 4 events that I think shaped his consciousness about making a decision of leaving Bulgaria. One could argue it was the wrong decision, because he could have stayed in Bulgaria. Had he stayed in Bulgaria, I think he would have fared very well. A lot of the Bulgarian Jews that remained after the war did quite well. The ones that were, for instance, part of the Communist Party, then found really nice jobs as part of their communist administration and left later. So he made a decision. Was it the right decision? I'll never know, but I think that's another topic that several scholars are preoccupied with, about what influences people who made decisions at the time. So they arrived in Palestine in 1944. They met some relatives from Romania and other places. He immediately became involved with the local community. He gave a talk a month after he arrived. He gave a talk about the state of Bulgarian Jews. That's the ad that's shown here. That's there below in 1944 with my father, who was 16 at the time. This is the identity card he received from the British once he arrived. Conditions were tough. they lived in one room, literally one room, not just one bedroom flat, just one room, which was a kitchen, bedroom, and soon clinic. So at night, my father slept on the kitchen table, which during the time was also the desk that my grandfather used to receive patients. For several years it remained like that. He was involved in treating various Jewish officers, Jewish warriors that fought against British and against Arabs. So he treated many flesh wounds. But they were refugees. Didn't take long before they did quite well for themselves and managed to again create a position for themselves in life. And then 1948, after the UN declaration, my father was by then a bit older, took part in the 1948 war, the Independence War. Some pictures showing him being involved in various, well, these are posed photographs, but he was involved in actual wars, in actual battles around Palestine. So just as finishing words, decision makings, this is a letter for Freud, another refugee from Vienna to London, to write to Reich, his disciple that moved to America earlier, about decision making. And from my point of view, those decisions are really based on unconscious motives. One can never really tell why we make those decisions. In retrospect, hopefully we get to have some insights about whether we're right or wrong. Quick reference to Sac de Bille, Joseph Joffo film, which you probably have seen, which I think depicts very well that moment where the father makes a decision for his two older sons that they need to leave for Provence, and thus saves their life, but not his own. He dies in the war. And just another footnote, incidentally or not, in this very building in 1963, I told Tony about this earlier. In 1963, in this very building, my father was passed his medical exams for the FRCS specialization in plastic surgery, medicine. So me being here is like some kind of a completion of one chapter in the history of life. So thank you very much.